Welcome to another CHRO Conversation, hosted by the Center for Executive Succession at the Darla Moore School of Business. I'm your host, Anthony Nyberg, and today we are speaking with Craig Haydamack, Senior Vice President and CHRO for Milliken & Company, a nearly 150-year-old company and one of the world's leading private innovation companies with more than 35 manufacturing plants around the world and more than 5,000 associates. It is notable that Milliken makes more than 18,000 products and has been granted more than 2,500 U.S. patents and more than 5,500 patents worldwide. So Craig, hey, as always, thank you for coming down. We sincerely appreciate having you here on campus.
It's a pleasure to be here with you all and the students.
So Craig, we've talked a lot about the strategic role of HR and its importance in an organization, particularly now, and it seems to have become more important over time. Can you give some examples of how HR can really influence the enterprise?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different levels and ways that can happen. There's the traditional piece around workforce planning of how many people do we need, what skills, what locations, how do we evolve the workforce to match those needs. I think it more and more goes even more deeply now in terms of sort of the undercurrents of the labor market, of cultural changes, things like that, the company has to evolve to support not only the business direction and strategy, but also the needs and desires of the talent that you're trying to develop and hire and keep in that space. So things like, obviously the traditional workforce planning, but things like your incentive designs. Another piece I think is critical is the communications and messaging to the organization has a huge effect on steering it in the right direction. In the last couple of years especially, I've had the opportunity to work closely with our Chief Marketing Officer about communications, messaging, storyline to the associates. How do we tie together our business strategies, our values, and our direction, and how we're sort of navigating the different turbulence of the environment. And so that work around lining up the messages from the beginning of the year to the closing of the year and everything in between is critical to help steering people in the right place. So I think there's, again, the traditional elements of workforce planning, but those additional layers of helping to steer and coach the organization in the right direction. There's also the elements of how are we monitoring wage trends, flows of labor in different locations, how's that impacting a business's decision around locations, or around how much it can afford in terms of wages and benefits and adjustments. All those items are constantly in flux and need to be a regular dialogue back and forth between HR and the businesses to make sure we're making the right decisions along the way.
So you just mentioned as part of that working with the marketing group. Mm-hmm. And when we were talking earlier, you talked about how interesting HR was because of the having to deal with so many different groups. Can you just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things I think is wonderful about an HR career is how many connections there are. And HR is really a team sport at the end of the day. And so I think in a typical week, the HR group, we're obviously working with the businesses, but we're also working side by side with the marketing group on our communications and helping to steer the organization. We work very, very closely with our CFO and the finance organization on every workforce decision, incentive decision, investments, benefits, et cetera. More and more we work closely with the IT group in terms of our HR systems, and more into analytics and how do we get automated data and interactive dashboards and things we use to help steer the business and try to develop new technologies that help us more efficient, more connection to the outside, recruiting candidates, and how do we create a better employee experience. We work very closely with legal, even government relations. So all of those groups are interacting to try to tackle these different issues and put the company in the right direction. I think we've, in the last 2 years, with all of the challenges we've all had out in the business world, those connections have even been stronger, and we appreciate more and more how critical that connection is. And I think for HR folks, recognizing that, building those partnerships, working across those disciplines, collaborating is critical. And I think for HR folks, you're also helping to develop, grow your own skill set. You're getting to know those other disciplines and those considerations, and helps you grow your own personal toolbox.
So it sounds like for HR professionals, it's certainly a critical skill to be able to work across all of these different dimensions. But it also sounds like, just to brag on HR a little bit, that HR may be the function that has the most cross-functional roles or needs to interact with everyone? Is that fair?
I think so. My opinion, again, not maybe slightly biased, but I think of all the different disciplines and functions, I think HR touches virtually every element of the company, and almost every HR situation that you tackle has a financial implication, a technology implication, a policy implication, a cultural implication. So you have to have all of these connections, these partners to get something, get something done and move the business forward. I think about a situation where we tackle, we make an acquisition, for example. All of those disciplines are working together literally on a daily, weekly basis for sometimes 2 years to actually make that acquisition happen and make it successful and to see the value out of that. Or tackling a pandemic or whatever the situation is, you've got to have all those folks working together. So I think it's HR is a fantastic space. It challenges you in so many ways and will grow your skill sets far beyond what the traditional core HR discipline is. So.
And another aspect that you touched on in the first question is the kind of the importance of looking at wages, and I presume particularly in a time like now when there's such incredible inflation going on. What does wage inflation mean in terms of how it's affecting the business overall, and then what does HR need to be doing to respond to that?
It's a great question. This is kind of an unprecedented period probably in our careers that we're going to see this type of inflation, and there's a number of different implications of it at different levels. One is just at the baseline is you've got to stay in market with the wages just to be able to hire and retain people. And traditionally in HR, we do the annual compensation surveys to see how numbers were shifting. Those annual reports are frankly way too little too late at this point. And so we've developed an analytic discipline around how do we go out and monitor wages that are advertised from different companies, different locations, to basically create a somewhat real-time monitor of how wages are shifting, so we can communicate that with our business and our hiring managers about what we've got to do to stay in market and also to avoid excessive turnover. So that's sort of a core HR piece. But then there are a lot of other implications to inflation that go into different areas. So, for example, as your cost of your wages go up and your raw materials go up, companies have to raise their prices to maintain their margins over time. And in the U.S., we've had low inflation for a long time. We haven't had to develop a lot of skills around price negotiation and pushing those different items. And so you might see a space where an HR group is helping to deliver training and support on negotiation skills and pricing skills and things like that to help an organization build some muscles that maybe it hasn't had to use in a long time. Or managing working capital and inventory. How do you develop those skills and get additional resources and systems and training and things to help manage inventories and working capital in a much more turbulent environment? So there's sort of the direct HR traditional impacts, and then there's sort of domino business impacts that ultimately turn into people impacts at some point.
So those are really interesting, because those are often areas, especially those latter parts, that I don't think people would attribute to being an HR, important for HR to be doing. So that's super. I also want to ask you about, so there's been a lot of discussion about the Great Resignation. Mm-hmm. So first, do you think it's real? Is that a real thing, or have we just made up another term to be popular?
Sell ideas. Yeah. Unfortunately, it is real, and we have seen it. And talking to CHROs, all over the region, they're all seeing it. The patterns that we see are there's really seems to be sort of three primary drivers for folks when there's so many available jobs. One is that there are some people that are very heavily financially motivated and looking to say I can take a 10 or 15 or 20% step up, and that's their primary driver. We have seen some others that have the work from home is a overriding concern desire for them, and so they're going to go and take a role that is 100% working from home, and they have those opportunities now in different places they never had before. And also you see some folks that may feel their career is stalled, or they're looking for some kind of a change and they're kind of making a shift. So we see this space where folks are using this opportunity to upgrade pay, a work-life balance, or take a career shift. The challenge for all of us, I think, then is we have to compete not just on pay and stay current with the market, but we also have to compete on culture and our environment and our values that we're creating for our employees. This is a place that they want to stay, that they feel good about the company that they work for, the values, and they also feel it's a place that they're being developed and they have opportunities to grow. And so I think that, we think about the Great Resignation, I think people immediately think about wages, but I think it's, on the big picture, it's so much about culture and employee development and engagement and the culture you're creating as it is just the wage piece. And so I think HR groups are challenged in both of those areas, in financially and in the culture, to do it right to help, frankly, attract and to retain the folks that you need.
So quite related to that, I think, is at least Milliken and Company has for a very long time been a leader in thinking about broader stakeholders. I think really caring about not exclusively the financial return, but also about the local community, employees, other stakeholders. And that, I presume that's something to do with the values of the Milliken family. Can you share a little bit about what the business case for doing that for the long term might be?
More and more, and this is a big trend we've seen in the last 3, 4, 5 years, as we think about recruiting and bringing in top talent and bringing them into the company, more and more those candidates are interviewing the company as much as the company is interviewing them. Tell us about your values. Is it just a poster on the wall, or do you really mean it? How do you show proof that you're really doing it? Are you an inclusive community? Are you being environmentally responsible? And candidates are more and more using that as a decision factor on what company they're going to go to, which is a good thing for companies and for them and for society over the long term. And so if you think about over the long term, if you want to have a strong, stable organization that attracts top talent, you have to be high performing from a values and social responsibility standpoint. The other aspect we see is that more and more in sort of business to business environment, that other companies are checking and sort of testing and vetting companies they're going to work with about their values. So it's not unusual for us if we're selling our products to another company that we'll get a very large supplier qualification form that'll talk about our values, our inclusion, our sustainability, all those elements as much as our ability to produce and deliver. And so from a business imperative standpoint, it's about your talent, and more it's about your ability to actually have partnerships and transact with other companies.
So if it's about those two things, will it be sustainable even when there's a bit of an economic downturn?
My view, kind of to speaking with my group, is at some point we're going to have a recession. We may be on the edge of one right now, but those are going to last only so long. And when we come out of that, the talent market is going to rebound quickly, and things are going to shoot back. And the trends that we're seeing now are going to just continue, if not accelerate. So we're going to see a downturn, but I think of it as maybe more of a timeout than a long-term shift. And so I think it's important that companies and HR teams maintain those values and those consistency items throughout. If as soon as you get a tough time, if you kind of throw your values out and disinvest in things, they're really not your values, and people will see through that, and you're going to lose momentum. So I think that when we eventually have a downturn for any business, keeping your don't give away your values and those foundations of what it means for your company, because you're going to need them. And people are going to judge you on that, and it's going to either help you accelerate out of that downturn, or it could distract from that.
So is this another place then that HR really has an important impact?
It is, absolutely, and I think that an influence of HR into the business is, in a company, you go in a downturn or a difficult period, could be easy to say, well, anything that's sort of employee development related, values related, community related, those are just extras. We got to lock in on our exclusively on our margins. We're going to cut every cost we can possibly cut, and that can be the mindset, but we don't realize that the implications of what those cuts may do over the long term, and it's hard to build back those sort of cultural and values assets you've built up over time. And so I think HR has a voice in balancing those items. About our financial responsibility and business outlook, and also our values and our culture, and are we considering all those factors as we make those trade-offs? There's always trade-offs there, but we need to make sure that the culture values part of the equation is represented at the table.
And you've long talked about the importance of analytics in HR, and you even gave a really amazing example of creating a software program to actually follow hourly wages basically in real time. So have we moved to a spot where analytics, like this from a skill set for people, is now table stakes, or is it still an add-on?
Well, it's a great thing. I think there's a little element of both of it. I think for an HR person, they've got to be functional in going in, analyzing a data set, looking for patterns, and finding a way, importantly, to create a visual exhibit, infographic, whatever it is, to help tell the story of the data. And I think that an underappreciated, underdeveloped skill is that ability to actually develop the exhibits that are impactful, influential, and tell a story without putting a giant table of numbers up on a screen. So there is a baseline table stakes that you have to do to be able to tell those stories and find the patterns. I think there's also HR folks in the analytics space that really excel, go a step beyond, where they're doing the numbers, doing the patterns, but they're also going out and pulling in external data and other qualitative data to help build out the story. So they may, for example, we had a project where we were mapping all the other companies in our area that were making investments in manufacturing, warehousing, to understand what the long-term trend would be on the labor markets, or picking up stories and data on trends from our different locations of what's happening, and sort of little case studies that help kind of illuminate the data in other ways. So I think the analytics for folks that really excel, they have that core data and storytelling skill, and they're able to go out and research and bring in some of the qualitative data to really round out the story. That's when it's really most impactful. So.
And at the Center for Executive Succession, we of course talk a lot about the role of the CHRO in particularly CEO succession and the planning and that whole process. Does the CHRO have a role to play in the succession planning of other C-suite executives? So, for example, a CFO, and if so, can you share a little bit about what that process would be?
It's a really important topic, and over the years I've come to appreciate more and more how important that is as you have expected retirements or unexpected transitions over time. In our case, we actually have a system and a schedule and a series of business reviews where, for roughly our top 200 or so positions in the company, we have developed a succession pipeline of folks ready now, ready over the next 5 years, and folks that are long-term potential. And so we have mapped those out. We use that to help us steer development plans, to grow people, to do rotations, to different experiences. And ideally, you have a lot of that talent is able to go into multiple channels. So they may be qualified to be a CFO, or they might also be qualified to be a business manager. So they can kind of go multiple paths. And so, and the more optionality that a company has with its talent, the better and stronger it is. So definitely HR can help map those items. And you really look, I think the foundation of it is it's not stovepipe talent succession plans, but it's more of a multifunctional pool that can go multiple places across the enterprise, and that talent's more of an enterprise asset than a stovepipe asset.
You talked a little bit about, when we were talking about the Great Resignation, about some of that is due to people that really want to work remotely. They learned during the pandemic it's possible, and they want to keep that going. Have you been experiencing that? Is that a part of what's going on at Milliken?
Yeah, we are. It's a challenge for us because we make physical stuff. We make carpet, and we make textiles and different things. And so for us, probably 85% of our positions need to be physically in a plant or in a lab or some product development center, things like that. They can't be done remotely. And so for us, the challenge has been figuring out where's that dividing line of jobs that can and can't be done remotely, and also sort of the cultural implications out of sort of the fairness, the communications when you have so many folks inside the company working daily and some folks that are remote. So we've been working to find the right balance of that. We definitely have a space where in our case, we're requiring 3 days of work in the office, 2 days remote. We put in a number of IT tools and things like that to help make that more fluid and connected. And we've also in a space where, with the talent shortages out there, we've started to make decisions where there's unique talent you can't hire. We may hire somebody in another city and they're fully remote because that's the only opportunity to actually bring that talent in. So I think we're going through that learning curve of 85% in the office and lab and 15% partially remote or fully remote, and trying to build those communication bridges.
And how do you handle the inequities that are the perceived inequities, is really how I'd say it, about someone who particularly someone who has to be in a factory every day and saying, hey, this isn't fair. First, they probably make the other people making more money, and now you're letting them work from home too.
In that space, yeah, it's a tough one. There's not an easy answer to that. I think folks that are on a certain career path, that kind of goes with the territory of those paths. I mean, people may choose to go in a different direction, different career path over time. Part of our story, so how do we create development opportunities and rotation opportunities over time for people could, if they choose, could kind of go in different pathways. Part of it also for us over the last couple of years obviously has been, the pandemic has been frankly safety, and saying, our safety is number one. For folks that are in the office, we're going to take all these different precautions to make sure that this is a safe environment, ideally the safest environment you can be in. And then as we have folks remote and distributed, that's helping us to help socially distance and reduce things over time, reduce that exposure over time. And so that's been part of the storyline as well. But it is, there's not an easy answer to that one.
How does this affect, if people are working more remotely, does that affect leadership opportunities or the way you train leaders? We used to have such a big emphasis on perhaps international rotations and things of that nature. Yeah. So how do we balance that as we think about going forward, even 10, 15 years into the future?
Yeah, I think it's a great one. I think leaders we have to develop leadership skills to be able to operate in that multi-location, multidisciplinary environment. And so it can be easy to fall into the trap of, as a leader, the people that are in the room in front of me are the focal point, everybody else is, sort of in a satellite space, and that's not a good outcome. And so how do you create team meeting settings, communication settings, one-on-one schedules, all types of connection points so that the folks that are maybe remote or a different geography, whatever, feel as connected to the company as they can be as somebody who's sitting there on a day in, day out basis. And so managers to be very conscious of that and very overt in setting up the way their management systems of how they interact with people to have that be fair and consistent across those different platforms. And frankly, being trying to be conscious of the unconscious bias of engaging people in different ways because of where they're located. So it's going to take some time I think for all companies to adjust their leadership training and for folks to kind of build that skill to how to really do that well.
Have you found things that are particularly effective for helping build even a culture when you have a lot of people that are not there every day, or even those that are only coming in 60% of the week? In that space,
yeah. There's a few things that I see us learning and getting better at as we go into this space. Say, for example, is let's say you're going to drive an initiative and you've got 3 or 4 people that work exclusively in the office, and you might have somebody in another city and somebody that is partially remote, things like that. I think that when you drive an initiative, you got to recognize those critical collaboration points that have to happen together as a group. So, for example, if you're having a chartering event to start a new initiative, if possible, you're better to try to bring people together for a day and go through the charter, answer questions, ensure they're pointing in the right direction together. So when they're distributed, they can work more effectively and more consistently in that space. So I think chartering, progress checkpoints, occasionally there's a point in some initiative where you really need to do some more intense discussion, dialogue, debate, and design work. Those are points where you really need to try to get people together in a room with a giant whiteboard to work through something. Those are maybe only 10% of the time in an initiative. The other 90% of the time, they've got to be able to work more fluidly and connected. So we've been putting in a lot of technology tools in different spaces that help us share documents, to help us collaborate. We're actually putting in video screens that are larger. It can do multi-camera, so you can have multiple remote people connected more directly with people in the room, so it feels more seamless. There's also even something, it sounds simple, but some speakerphones that plug into your PC so that everybody in the room can be on a Teams or a Zoom, talk through one voice, so you don't have all kinds of audio problems, things like that. So I see us getting better at using the technology when we're distributed, and then recognizing that 10% of the time when you really need to be together, where it's a critical juncture point, that you invest the time to get people together for those items.
So that's really being intentional about when you bring people in, and so that they understand why they're being pulled into the office.
That's right, yeah. It's a point where we collectively, if we're together, our collective work, collaboration, that free-flowing dialogue, the 90% of our communication that's nonverbal, all that stuff counts and is needed in that situation to move something forward. And so let's invest that little bit of time to do that, and that'll make all of our work easier than when we're back in our different locations. We can flow forward knowing that we're in alignment with our teammates in other places.
And how about just the onboarding process for people that are, it used to be a big part of how you would even learn the culture, learn what was expected of you, would be that you'd be observing it all the time. If you're not ever coming to the office, like some of the people you've described, or even if you're only in there 3 days a week.
Right.
How do you affect that, or have you seen extra challenges with onboarding?
We've definitely had to, frankly, re-engineer our onboarding approach over the last couple of years. And for a couple of reasons. One is that remote distributed workforce, and then also during the pandemic, you just couldn't get people together, so you had to do it virtually. So we have re-engineered to a place where when somebody comes into the company or small groups come in, we'll very rapidly do a series of virtual orientation sessions to help them get connected to the company, which includes with time with each of the executives of each of the divisions and functions of the company. So very quickly they get into that space. We typically also bring somebody in for tours and meals and seeing the plants and labs and things, so they get a feel for what the company's like. So when they're back in their remote office, they have a much better sense of what things are like. So we've been modifying to that space where we get some rapid connections when somebody first starts. And then also what we do is several times a year is we actually do schedule a week-long, we call it Discover Milliken, where folks come on site and they're really immersed in the company and have sort of a complete sort of week-long orientation sabbatical. And we schedule those throughout the year so people can work them into their schedule and at some point come and spend that time in the company, see a plant, see a lab, things like that. So we sort of the rapid virtual hybrid onboarding, and then at some point in their first year a deeper in-person orientation.
So that's interesting, because it sounds like as things have become a little bit more remote, you've actually made the onboarding efforts more intentional and intense to some extent.
Absolutely, and talking with our leaders about the importance of them coming in and broadcasting and sharing their story of their divisions, because you have folks in our case all over the country that are connecting and contributing to that mission, and for our leaders to be very recognized that they have this distributed team that they need to get aligned and motivated and engaged. And so our leaders, I think, we get more and more practices, they're doing a better job of telling the story, visualizing the story, using videos, using different exhibits to help really get the message across in different ways to help engage people in that space. So I think as we practice, we're getting a little better and a little better and a little better at it. And then when those limited times when people are all together, how do you take the time to not only go through the business discussions, but leaders need to facilitate a space where there's a lot of open dialogue, discussion, and people can start to feel that connection together. And even ideally even if it's as simple as a meal or something from a team building standpoint, to invest and make ensure that the team, when that event ends, they not only understand the direction and they feel some connection, but they feel some of that passion and alignment for the team that they're part of. And so I think that sort of combination of factors is critical, and it's frankly much easier when everybody's in the same building. And you said the word intentional. It's critical that you're very thoughtful and planning that and thinking about it when we're in this environment. And that's going to be I think a difference-making leadership skill for all of our leaders and for HR going forward.
How do you, from an HR perspective, get your managers to really do that when they're so busy already? Yeah. Their schedules were completely full, and now you're saying, okay, but now you need to carve out time to intentionally do all these. Yeah. So I don't do it myself. That's why I'm looking for help.
You do it, yeah. I think it's a really simple element, but for HR to be really good at frankly early planning. So we go into right now here in later part of 2022. We think about 2023. Already talking about our calendar for the year, when the onboarding events are going to happen, leadership conferences, things like that. So really for us, I think the key is getting there early, being very disciplined, detail-oriented, and planning things out, and getting these sort of cultural, milestone, organizational events on the calendar and locked in so managers can work around them. And I think when you come to a leader anywhere at the last minute to try to do something, it's never going to work very well. So I think that's one of the maybe hidden important skills of HR is that planning, project management, discipline, to able to allow these things to happen in a thoughtful way versus them being an ad hoc kind of chaotic manner. So I think a lot of discipline and a lot of early warning and planning is critical there. So.
I see our students lining up to see you soon. So, so again, thank you very much for everything and for coming down here. We sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you. Really enjoy it, and we're very happy to support the school and the program. So thank you.
You just listened to another CHRO conversation. Today, Craig Haydamack of Milliken and Company shared his views regarding some of the unique challenges that exist for human resources and his expectation for how HR can drive business. As we see once again, HR leaders must be creative, courageous, and understand the strategic goals of the organization to be most effective. On behalf of all of us who are associated with the Master of Human Resources program and the Center for Executive Succession here at the University of South Carolina, thank you for joining us.